Hello internet! I actually need to tone down my energy levels for this video, so I'll be a little bit more quiet, a little bit more professional, just because in about 3.5, 4 hours, I'm gonna be at a local soccer club talking to the parents while their kids are out running on the fields. So essentially we're gonna cover how we can, as you can tell by the title of the video, fueling athletes, debunking macronutrient myths, and just optimizing performance and recovery. There is going to be parts of this video that's more tailored towards, I guess, parents or feeding others, but you could just twist that to feeding yourself. If you're interested in this topic, there's definitely going to be a lot to cover, and there's a lot of slides. Obviously, the lecture that I'm going to do in person is going to get modified. I'm going to skip over topics, but the one on YouTube is where I can spend as much time as I want getting to some of the nuances. So without further delay, let me put myself in the corner so you can see my beautiful slide deck. All right, let's get into it. Of course, I'm gonna show off my art skills to start the presentation. What do we have here? Take a moment to pause and reflect on this beautiful masterpiece that I spent all day yesterday drawing. And of course, it's just a person eating. And the question we always ask is, why? Why do we eat? Why do we do anything? And when it comes to eating, we're eating to get energy. So now let me ask you this. How do you know that your body needs more energy? What does that feel like? Well, it feels like hunger, right? You feel a little hungry, sometimes a little hangry, depending on how long it's been. And when you eat something, then you feel full. So where does this energy actually come from? Well, it's going to be coming from the food. And specifically, we're talking about the 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And I have some numbers on this slide, but what I'm really trying to show you is that you can eat a lot of calories even in one sitting with the pizza, the hamburger here. I think I see some ice cream there. You can get a lot of calories in, and it's a lot of energy, but unfortunately, hours later, you're going to find yourself hungry again. Sometimes it could be 5-6 hours, but sometime during that day, you're gonna be hungry again. So what's going on, right? Well, the big piece here, and a piece that a lot of people miss, is that it's not just about the calories, it's about feeling full, and that's where volume comes in. This is why I always talk about food and calorie density. It's also a great way to remove some of the politics surrounding food and just get straight into the numbers, and also organize our brain when it comes to talking about food. Kind of gives us a bit of a scale to look at and categorize things, which is really important. We have to cover a lot regarding like carbohydrates, protein, fat, what to eat. So this is how we kind of frame things. I'm gonna go through these pretty quickly because if you've seen my other videos, you already seen me go through them. So we're gonna talk about it mostly in per pound, just easier to visualize. So very quickly, fat is the most calorie dense nutrient. So when you have a pound of it, as in oil, you have about 4,000 calories per pound. And butter is about 3,200, nuts and seeds about 2,600, junk food is about 2,300. Cheese is about 18, sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower, depending on the cheese. These are just examples. And then we get a pure sugar about 17, sometimes 1750, 1800, depending on how refined it is. And this is pretty interesting, right? Because for carbohydrates and protein, a gram only has 4 calories versus fat that has 9 calories. So it turns out that a tablespoon of oil is 120 calories, while a tablespoon of sugar is only 50 calories. And if you haven't seen my other videos kind of talking about this, or this is kind of new to you, definitely encourage you to check out some of my other lectures. I have a playlist on my YouTube channel. But the short story is, a lot of people kind of go out of their ways to not get added sugars in, but we miss that added oil is sort of twice or more than twice as sort of worse on a pure calorie standpoint. And as we'll see in this talk, those carbohydrates aren't something we're concerned about, especially when we're being active, because we need that. That's our sort of, you could say, more optimal or more efficient fuel. We're gonna get more into it though. Flour products, about 1,200 calories per pound. Meat, seafood, about 1,000, sometimes more, especially when you fry things, right? And then pasta, white rice is pretty interesting. It's actually closer to 600 calories per pound. Even though this is a relatively refined carbohydrate, when you have a pound of dry pasta, it turns into 2 pounds of food because the water comes in, so the calorie density gets cut in half. So that's pretty important. It means that instead of eating like a pound of bread, you can eat 2 pounds of pasta. 2 pounds of pasta is, of course, quite a bit more filling. It's twice as much food, but it's the same amount of calories. And that's really where this concept comes into play here. Okay, and then we have legumes, beans, lentils, peas at 500 to 600. We have root vegetables like potatoes, sweet potatoes, squashes, whole grains, about 300 to 500. And then we have fruits, about 200 to 300, sometimes a little bit less. And then leafy and other vegetables, about 60 to 200. And of course, water is going to be at 0 calories. So then I have this beautiful graph showing calorie density. We can see calories per pound ranging from 0 all the way to 4,000. we can see the most calorie dense food is going to be oil at 4,000, and the least is going to be vegetables, averaging about 100 calories per pound. So right when we look at this, we can see that these foods over here, they have something that these foods do not have. And one of these components these foods are going to have is going to be water, right? But if I were to ask you what fills you up more, apple or apple juice? Well, you would say the apple fills you up more, because even though they both have water, they both have mostly carbohydrates. The water and the carbohydrates goes through you rather quickly when you have a glass of apple juice. But if you have an apple, it takes some time, and that's because of that fiber component, right? The fiber and water create a bit of bulk, basically slows down the digestive process, which is what we want. So then a few other things I'll just point out here rather quickly. Vegetables, 100 calories per pound. If you bring that to scale with the oil, that means a tablespoon of oil is going to be 120, which is more than a pound of some vegetables. That's a very massive difference in that scale. The calories start to concentrate and climb incredibly quickly. So even when we look at that tablespoon of oil, it's only like this much food. It's actually a lot of calories packed in there that our brain can't. I mean, it's not a natural food, so our brain doesn't quite comprehend that, put it that way. It's hard to comprehend that and wrap our head around that number. So the other thing that I'll point out is, of course, all the favorite foods are over here, the cheesy, the junk foods, the buttery stuff. And that's something I'm going to get more into in this talk, of course, especially because when it comes to families, when it comes to having kids, I meet a lot of parents that have kids that are very picky eaters. But of course, they're usually picky about the things more on the green bar, more on the left side here, rather than some of the stuff that's more calorically dense. Hard to be picky about ice cream, right? Okay. So for a very active person, what would you say out of these three is the most important? You can take a moment to reflect here. I'm gonna get some water. It's good water. Okay, of course they're all important, but there are some differences between them. For carbohydrates, leading to, during the activity, after the activity, we'll get into this a little bit more, are quite important. Protein you want after at some point because of course you need it. And then fat, you do need some technically, but when it comes to fat, you can start to think of your body as having an almost unlimited amount of it, because any whole foods have fat to them. It means that you're always getting some in your diet, put it that way. Okay, and yeah, we're gonna get into it right here. So what happens during exercise? Well, the body is burning energy, and being more specific, it's the muscles are burning more energy, right? That's the big difference that's happening. When it comes to the carbohydrates, it's not that they have more energy. Fat is obviously more calorically energy dense, but they have the greatest efficiency. As long as oxygen is available, they have the fastest conversion to ATP to energy. But of course, we only have a limited amount of glycogen stores. So what ends up happening when we eat some carbohydrate-rich food, even if it's just like, I don't know, syrups and candy, we'll get into this, even if it's relatively refined carbohydrate food, is that it enters our bloodstream and it gets stored in our little tiny bit in our kidneys, but mostly in our liver. And of course, in our muscles, because we have a lot of muscle mass. So that's where most of the carbohydrates get stored, and they get used when I swing my hands like this when I'm talking. Okay, so, and then yeah, and there is a preference during higher intensity activity to be burning more carbohydrate stores, just because you need to match that intensity energy demand. So if you're doing some higher intensity exercise, you basically increase that demand of how much energy you need, and glycogen stored sugar is the way you meet that demand. As they start to deplete, of course, the body starts shifting towards more fat and protein, and we'll get into some of the interesting pieces about that as well. For fat, there's a slower efficiency to it, but like I said, there's almost an unlimited amount of it, so it's a high storage. There is a preference to burn fat during moderate, longer activities. Oxygen is entering at a bit of a slower rate, so your body has more time to kind of burn that fat and utilize it for energy. Okay, protein. Very poor efficiency, because in order to use protein for energy, you do need to convert it to essentially ketones or glucose. Okay, so let's talk about carbohydrate-rich foods. This is a very simple little scale. On one side, we have unrefined, so think about fruits and vegetables, produce section of your store, the backyard garden, and then we have more refined, right? So as we start refining things, of course, things start to taste better. We go from brown rice to white rice. This is why people like white rice better. Eventually, we can go to rice flour. We can go to a syrup. You can do the same thing with like oats. You have oat groats, steel cut, rolled. Actually, you get a lot of variations even around those. but you can refine that to an oat flour and then so on. Pure sugar is actually fructose and glucose based, while the examples I hear are more glucose, starch based, you can say. So of course, as you refine things taste better, but that's our preference for finding more calorie rich food. Of course, if you have a weight loss goal, it's better to move in the unrefined direction. You're getting less calories per pound, you're getting a little bit more fiber, trying a little bit more protein, so it makes the food a little bit more filling, right? You're getting more satiety for less calories coming in. That's sort of the weight loss side of things. But if you don't have that weight loss concern and you're just eating and trying to fuel yourself or fuel your kids for their soccer game, soccer practice, then we gotta talk about the other refined side of things a little bit. So I just have a simple graph here. At the bottom there, we have time, and then we just have your body's blood sugars. So that red line there, you can consider yourself at baseline, and then we're gonna see what happens if we have some juice. Well, with juice, like we saw with the apple juice examples, it enters very, very quickly. That sugar enters very, very quickly. And when that happens, your blood sugars spike, right? Now, unfortunately, when they spike, your body thinks, wow, look how much sugar is coming in, and it overshoots the insulin. When it overshoots the insulin, insulin ends up putting too much sugar away. So then you actually get this rebound hypoglycemia. You basically crash. So this is kind of like the classic, give kids a bunch of sugar, they're all energetic, and they kind of crash later. Not exactly how it usually works when people see that. I mean, kids' energy levels are just like all over the place. But this does happen, of course, even to adults. If you have a bagel in the morning and maybe with some jam or something, and some juice or even like a smoothie, and then a few hours later you're hungry, you're hangry, and it's because your blood sugars have dipped, so your body's like, and you need to get some more food about it. On the athletic side of things, many runners, likewise people that do endurance sports, have a lot of first-hand experience with this. Basically, you kind of bonk. So basically what ends up happening is if you take like an energy gel, if you look on the package of an energy gel, it'll say take every 45 minutes. And the reason for that is if you take a refined carbohydrate and you intake that, well, now your blood sugars have spiked, which is great because you'll feel super energetic, you'll feel amazing, but your body's gonna put too much blood sugar away and then you'll actually crash. So you kind of need to maintain that carbohydrate intake once you started it. So bit of a warning there for anyone that does endurance sports. Keep some sugar around you, and if you end up using it, make sure you have more sugar around you. Okay, and of course, it does return back to baseline. In your typical day-to-day example, even if your blood sugars crash, wait 10, 15, 20 minutes later, your body's gonna correct it. This is not like some super, super harmful thing that's gonna lead to health consequences down the road. Some people use this as kind of like, they make a mechanism out of it for like how people get diabetes and insulin resistance. Not quite how it works. That's a topic for another discussion. But if you were to get an apple instead, like I said, with that fiber component, now it takes your body some time to kind of break things up, so you got a much more gradual release. This is kind of what you want in your day-to-day life, even leading up to your activities. We'll get into the timing of food in a second, but this is much, much more preferred. It's a lot more pleasant, right? Rather than this sort of going up and going down, the roller coaster. Although the highs can be a lot of fun, that's for sure. Okay, I have a whole section on protein. Okay, so for the sake of this YouTube video and the fact that I still have 3 hours before I have to go talk 3 times, let's just do it. Proteins is our source of nitrogen, which is why we eat them. There's 9 essential amino acids. I'm sure you're aware of amino acids, but amino acids are basically the building blocks for protein. So they're kind of like letters of the alphabet in that if you take like THE, you have BA, right? So different amino acids, different combinations make the nails, the skin, the hair, and a whole lot of other compounds from like enzymes to hormones and so on. So daily losses is about 53 milligrams of nitrogen per kilogram of body weight. And of course, that's a rounded sort of average. But what this translates for 70 kg person is about 23 grams. So you're not losing a lot of protein every single day. That's very important to understand. From our hair, our skin, our nails, we lose about 3 grams a day. The remaining is lost through because some of our gut cells, for example, they'll use specific amino acids for energy. And yeah, there it is, about 3 grams a day. Minimum requirement's about 20-30 grams, which is about 4 or 5% calories from protein, which technically already has a little bit of a margin of error in it. So it's not a lot of protein. So, and this is kind of obvious in hindsight. We don't have taste receptors for protein. Egg whites, protein powder, tofu, they all taste very bland, right? These sort of pure protein foods or more pure protein foods. If you're talking to my parents, they never had a protein concern growing up, but these days you'll hear even some parents get concerned about protein. So it's kind of common knowledge in public space that protein equals muscle, right? That's the association that's been built. And it's a lot through marketing. Protein marketing is incredibly effective. I said this before, I wish I could hire them to do my marketing. But the question I want to ask is there any truth to it, right? Of course, we can oversell benefits of anything, but is there at least some benefits to it? So let's get into this. And now we're going to get into an example that I use quite often. And this is just an example that I use to just illustrate numbers to kind of show you how ridiculous the whole protein emphasis can be just purely looking at numbers. So to gain 25 pounds in a muscle in a year, if you do the math, about 75% of muscle is water, 25% is protein, carbs, fat, but if you assume it's all protein, you can do 25 pounds times 0.25 and you get about 6.25 pounds. You can convert that to grams, you can divide that by 365 to get your grams per day, and 7.7 grams a day is the answer you get for the unrealistic goal of gaining 25 pounds of muscle in a year. Beginner gains usually cap off at about like 17, 20 pounds max. And that's assuming 25% of muscle is protein. And that's how much extra protein you need on top of those like very low minimum requirements. Or if you want to use the RDA of 0.8 grams per kg, you can do it on top of that. And you're still likely much higher than that, just through your regular diet. So then the question becomes like, okay, well, minimum requirements are clearly very low. Extra protein doesn't exactly seem to go towards like the muscle building side of things, because to build even 25 pounds of muscle, you don't need that much extra protein. So is there actually some sort of benefit, or is more optimal? And the analogy that I like is if you're building houses and each house requires 10 doors and you have 100 doors, how many houses can you build? And of course the answer is, quick math, it's 10 houses, right? The rest of the supplies doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many windows you have, how many walls you have. Once you're out of doors, you're out. And that's considered kind of like a rate limiting step. So the body's similar in that the amino acids are your building supplies. As you can see on the slide here, methionine, lysine are typically lowest, but it does depend on your diet. And then extra protein, it does have a small anabolic effect, meaning that if you have more of these like essential amino acids, especially the methionine and lysine, then you're able to run this reaction more, you're able to build more houses. So your foot's on the gas just a little bit more, right? And if you're young, you're active, you're a professional athlete, that extra may be helpful for more optimal recovery. So it might be helpful. And the reason I'll say might is there is sort of an upper limit to this. Of course, you can't just take 2, 3, 4, 5, 600 grams of protein and expect it to kind of work like anabolic steroids. Your body's only able to do so much chemistry at a time without manipulating the hormone side of things, which of course I don't recommend. And then yeah, so extra does have a small anabolic effect, but there is also a downside to this because your body cells are only going to divide so many times. This is known as the Hayflick limit. And more growth and more cellular growth, more anabolic metabolism happening is effectively aging faster. And this means that you're going to have more problems earlier in life. And when I say earlier, maybe instead of running into, let's just say, cancer problems at 88, you run into them 82. Doesn't sound like a huge difference, but that's 6 years. That's quite a lot of time still. And the extreme example of the anabolic effect on aging health is, of course, steroid use. So for this, I'll say that if you factor in the minimum requirements and you were to do some math around your diet, you'll see that you're most likely, even without the protein bars, the protein shakes, you're already getting more than enough protein in. And maybe if you're young, active, professional athlete, or if technically you are a adolescent and you're still growing, then technically you should be striving for a little bit more protein. Or if you're a parent and your child is, we'll get into this in a moment, so deep in the pleasure trap side of things that all they're eating is refined carbohydrate, they're not eating any whole foods, at that point you might have to go out of your way a little bit to sneak in a little bit more protein. But that's, even in those cases, it's usually not needed whatsoever. But yeah, so very small niche case where extra may be beneficial, but you have to kind of run the pros and cons a little bit. And one of the big reasons you have to run the pros and cons is the extra protein isn't stored. The nitrogen is basically stripped off and excreted. It is a bit of metabolic burden. As I showed you earlier with the example of carbohydrates, fat, and protein for energy, like for energy use during exercise, the protein is a very inefficient pathway, right? So if you're always getting this extra protein in, your body has to convert it essentially to carbohydrate by stripping the nitrogen off it. And then methionine, cysteine specifically, they have some sulfur to them, which adds to that metabolic burden just because it tends to be more on the acidic side of things. So your body has to do more pH balancing the acid-base chemistry. And then, yeah, remember, this is why protein for energy isn't as efficient compared to carbohydrates and fat. It's just less efficient. So I see a lot of people going out of their way to go like sort of, you can say, protein shake right in before their workout, while your body is taking that extra protein, and your body actually has to do some extra work to get it to the carbohydrates, which is what it wants for the exercise, or what it needs, you could say, or what is more optimal. And yeah, all whole foods have enough protein. That's very important to understand. Sometimes we start categorizing as foods as this is a carb, this is a fat. Okay, no one really does the fat. This is a carb or this is a protein. But even very carbohydrate-rich foods like white rice technically have a proportion of the calories for white rice, about 7-8% calories from protein. And you can take a look at this if you want to see. It's also surprising that some foods that are considered like protein food, like even salmon and eggs, they're technically more high-fat foods than protein foods. Chicken breast tends to be one of the higher ratio ones. The short story for protein is eat enough whole foods and you will get more than enough. You can most likely save a lot of money regarding like the bars, the shake, these more like processed forms. All right, now we're gonna switch gears. We're gonna talk about picky eaters. And if you're not a parent, you don't have a child who's a picky eater, I encourage you to still watch this section because it is very interesting and you will most likely have degrees of pickiness, you could say, as well. So it's important to look at like what foods are they being picky with. I'm specifically talking about they've eaten very, very calorie-rich foods, and now they're refusing to eat anything resembling like even a fruit, even a vegetable, right? We're sort of talking about that. We're not talking about they like cauliflower but don't like Brussels sprouts. That's a different degree of pickiness, and that's a degree of pickiness we're okay with because there's a lot of variety in diets. So another graph for you today. The bottom we have time, and then we have pleasure on that y-axis there. So a story I like to share is when I went to Europe. Right before I went to Europe, just picture me eating very low calorie density foods, beans and rice. I promise it was a little bit more interesting at that time, but just kind of picture that, and this is how much pleasure I'm getting. The first day I never had eaten gelato there, but the second day I saw some chocolate gelato and I was like, yeah, you know what, I'll try a scoop. A scoop can't hurt. And that scoop took me sky high. It was absolutely a moment of pure bliss and pleasure. The rest of my friends took the train from Venezia, from Venice to Rome. I just flew there right with that scoop. But then something interesting happened, and it turns out that my body kind of got used to it because I found myself in Rome having 2, 3, 4 scoops of gelato after dinner instead of 1 scoop. And they're still tasting really good, don't get me wrong. They tasted amazing, but it wasn't like that first high I had. And the short story is you get used to it, right? It's the same story for a lot of compounds that use that sort of pleasure pathway in our brain. You are at baseline, you have some caffeine, you get used to the caffeine. And then unfortunately, when you try to not have that caffeine, or in my case, where I started feeling so crappy, I was like, I'm gonna buy a tub of spinach. I'm just gonna eat some spinach. I could get something nutritious in me. Is you try that spinach, right? Here's the spinach coming in, and it tastes much worse now than it did before. So now you've gotten used to the calorie-rich food. You think you're getting more pleasure because anytime you try to eat the less calorie-rich food, it makes you, I don't want to say barf, but it gives you a bit of a blah, this is so bland, boring, you're not interested in it whatsoever. And now we're in a tricky situation because even though hey, the right thing is for me to try to eat this less calorie-rich food, at least for my health side of things, for my athletic goal side of things, it gets difficult because your brain's like, no, the calorie-rich food's that way. So as Dr. Lau kind of puts it, who extra credit to this concept, doing the right thing feels like the wrong thing to do, and doing the wrong thing feels like the right thing to do. But you will return to baseline, and for food, depending on the compound, it can be about 2-3 months, so it's not absolutely terrible. And as you start to eat healthier, you do get used to it. The problem is many parents will find their kids kind of in this situation, and it's a very, I don't want to downplay this. It's kind of easy to see the big picture. It's like, okay, you eat rich food, you get used to rich food, eating healthier doesn't taste as good, so it's hard to do. Makes sense. But I don't want to downplay how difficult of a problem this is, right? And especially when it comes to children, because their brains aren't, you could say, fully developed enough to kind of understand the cost-benefit analysis better of the long-term health goal versus short-term calorie-rich food goal. It's kind of like, I never had this fantasy myself, but I imagine kids who had more stricter parents were dreaming of, oh, I can't wait to be an adult so I can just eat pizza and donuts and French fries all day long. Like that was a childhood dream, right? Of course, that dream, reality kind of hits that dream. So anyways, for food, it can be quite a bit of process, but you can imagine that if you start eating, you're even at school, your kid just had a pizza lunch and some ice cream or something, and now they have that one day at home, and now they're really starting to get used to it. It can be incredibly difficult to kind of pull them back. But I do have some tips and tricks. So yeah, the picky eater situation is you basically get used to eating rich food. And sometimes kids will, not sometimes, often they will protest, they will beg, cry, throw a tantrum right here. Yeah, they'll beg for this rich food because going hungry is actually in the brain when it runs its analysis. It's potentially a less costly option. Of course, they don't like consciously know this. We don't even consciously know this, but going hungry is a potentially less costly option, because if you eat that less rich healthy food, let's just say you're like, okay, I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat this boring potatoes and this rice and a few vegetables, but then I don't know, dad comes in and he brings in some leftover donuts from work. Well, now you're full and you made a huge survival mistake because you just missed out on this huge bounty of calorie rich food. That kind of results in your picky eater situation. And it does decrease as we get older. We get better reasoning and emotion management, of course. Well, I hope so. Not in my case. All right, solutions for the picky eater situation. If you find yourself in it, if you have a kid in it, you don't actually need to remove the fat, sugar, salts all at once. You want to start with the fat because it gives you more calories and less satiety. I'm not going to get into all the details about it, but then you want to do the added sugars and then you want to do the salt. You also want to start sneaking in some veggies, fruits, potatoes, beans, and I have some tips and tricks coming soon. And then when you're hungry, healthier options are more appealing. So it's kind of recognizing situations where like, hey, you know what? That salad doesn't seem all appealing to me right now, or my kid just had a really busy day, they didn't eat their lunch. Maybe they're going to be interested in these like baked potatoes or whatever it is. And yeah, you just want to take it step by step, start gradually reducing things. The other tip that I have here is that nuts and seeds, of course, compared to the other options in that calorie density range, they're much, much healthier. They have a fiber component to it. They have a small antioxidant kind of component to it too, which is important for the athletic side of things as well. So you can start substituting some of the, you can say, the fatty parts of the diet with that, and then transition even away from that. All right, this is the direction to move in. If anything, this is the goal that my YouTube channel kind of has. It's just making people aware that they can eat these very starchy foods. I'm not here to get all the science about it, but just take a look at the numbers, right? They're not that calorically dense. Populations that eat them tend to be much, much on the healthier side of things. If you look at like, you can take a look at like China, for example, before I think 1974-ish, before the Western foods made it there. In rural China, 90% of the diet was just white rice, and there's barely any cases of cardiovascular disease. Cancer rates are very low, no diabetes, no obesity, just overall. So, and it's just because it's a very safe food, especially for that rice. It's not that calorically dense. It's very difficult. You could overeat it, but it gets very difficult. And it gets near impossible to kind of overeat things like potatoes that are boiled, or squash, for example, or the veggies, right? So you want to at least try to make half your plate moving towards those foods, because unlike the fruits and vegetables, they actually have a huge satiety feeling and full component about it. And remember, these are the complex carbohydrates that are going to give us that nice sort of curve, blood sugar wise and energy wise, which is what we want. More or less, and I'll say more or less because there's a specific nuance to this, which I'll get into at the end of the video. But for the most part, for our activities, regardless what that activity is, we want to be carb loaded. We always want to have energy on board because it means we can work out a little bit harder, we can run a little bit more, and we can do that at a slightly higher intensity, which means that provided we get a good night's sleep, we make our gains, our progress a little bit faster, right? So vegetables, about 15 to 30%. You could technically, there's no harm in doing more. That's just sort of a range that I would kind of recommend. It gets harder to do more than 30% just because your diet's caloric density can get so low that you find yourself eating a lot more volume, right? You go from eating 3, 4, 5 pounds of food to like 6, 7, 8 pounds of food. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but lifestyle wise, that just gets difficult to do. And then I put a little category for richer foods here. This will depend person to person what their goals are. But I would say try to keep your richer foods between that 1,000 to 2,000 calories per pound standpoint. After that, besides, I guess you could say the nuts and seeds side of things, you get into pretty much very unhealthy foods that are directly causing harm to your body, which aren't helping you perform out there or recover any better. And then, yeah, fruit for snacks is the best sort of snack option, generally speaking. And then, yeah, water, drink of choice. Happy little water guy right there. Sometimes people get concerned what I mean by like starchy foods and what to eat, right? Because I basically got rid of all their favorite options. So the starchy foods, there is a massive list of them. This is actually a lot more interesting of a diet than just chips, cookies, burgers, pizza, fries. Of course, those foods have that irresistible fat, sugar, salt component to them. But in terms of pure variety, you can actually get a lot more variety this way, technically speaking. So yeah, any root vegetables, the potatoes, the yams, the sweet potatoes, winter squashes, the butternut, the pumpkin, falls here, whole grains, pasta, Asian noodles, beans, lentils, peas. You can take a screenshot of this if you want, or you can always do a Google search. Usually what I'll say is, like, if you're new to this kind of style and you're wanting to explore more, add more variety to your diet, next time you go grocery shopping, just buy a weird looking tuber type thing and Google and see what you can do with it. It's always an adventure. Always a good date night. Here I have a sort of what to eat before your activity. We just kind of covered generally on what to eat for your diet overall, but here is for the activity if you haven't eaten for maybe more than 6 hours, more than 4 hours, or more than 2 hours leading to your activity. I also say that, of course, timing wise, be careful eating right before your activity. Personally, I prefer about 60 to 90 minute window, but it does depend on what I eat, right? Some foods say, well, if you eat them even 5 minutes before, some do not. So play around with that. That's what practice is for. But before a big game day, definitely be careful in experimenting. Yeah. So if you haven't eaten for more than 6 hours, honestly, at that point, it's best to just eat a meal, just because that's the best way to top off those glycogen stores, those carbohydrate stores. If it's been more than 4 hours and maybe you need a large snack, maybe you need a small meal depending how big that previous meal was or how much you've eaten that day so far. And if it's been more than a couple hours, maybe you need a small snack just to top off those glycogen stores. But again, that depends on how big the meal was as well, right? Okay, so meal-wise, breakfast-wise, it would be to largely eat the least refined carbohydrate-rich foods, right? Because we're talking about eating before the activity, so even more important to get that in. Breakfast-wise, very simple. If you want some simple examples, like just oats and potatoes. Yes, those are my beautiful hands in that picture there, matching that chocolate oatmeal bowl. Lunch, dinner-wise, we can talk wraps, we can talk grain bowls, we talk sandwiches. I like Indian dal there as well, especially because the talk I'm doing at the local soccer club in a few hours is going to be primarily Punjabi or Indian folks. And then ideally, you do this with 0 or minimum oils and butters. I'm not going to get into this in this specific video right now, but I do have a previous video talking about blood flow and how you could say the oil side of things impairs blood flow. Impairing blood flow is a bad idea when it comes to athletic recovery and performance, because you want optimal blood flow, especially as we get older. But in the case of this presentation, just think of it as you don't want excess fat calories coming in, because unlike the carbohydrates and protein, our body already has more than enough stored. So excess is usually going to be problematic, especially, like I said, as we get older. So if you're going to go into this more medium territory, which again, depending on someone's diet, especially if you're a parent feeding your little one and your little one is very much pleasure trapped in that picky eater situation, this is a good place to kind of move towards. Breakfast wise, cereal works quite well, and I'll get into more tips, tricks on how we can sneak some healthier options in there, like a homemade burger, a creamy pasta, right? Still having that carbohydrate rich side of things, but also adding a little bit on the higher fat, a little bit higher on the calorie density side of things. And the worst option breakfast-wise would be like eggs and bacon, especially right before leading up to your activity, or like fast food and fried food. I don't think that's a huge surprise to anyone. And then if you're looking for more like a large snack, a small meal kind of leading up to that activity, smoothie works well, a fruit bowl, dried fruit, any of the meal options, but just in a smaller amount. I should mention, because you're probably seeing those fries there and thinking like, that is not a good idea. But those fries right there are made without any oil, so they're just potatoes baked with a little bit of ketchup. Of course, if you add even more salt to it, the ketchup has some salt to it, that salt can dehydrate you a little bit, right? It can leave you feeling thirsty, which isn't ideal beforehand. Better just have the baked potatoes just like that. Moving into more of that middle ground territory, like toast and organic jam, a dry cereal bowl, some juice, for example. Basically more on that pure carbohydrate side of things. Of course, you do have to worry that blood sugar potential situation, but that can be mitigated just by adding like a piece of fruit to it as well. The reason I'll say organic jam, I'll have an example of this in a moment as well, is just because when you have organic jam, you're gonna see the strawberries here are listed before the sugar. It usually means there's more fruit than sugar, which is preferred, of course. The slightly worse would be like sugary candy, soda, Cliff Bars, and similar snacks. They're just slightly worse on that side because they'll just have additives that aren't preferred, more on the health side of things, but they can still be a great option just because of how convenient they are, right? And then the worst would be the fried foods, chips, and most cookies. Okay, and then yeah, a couple hours before your activity, leading up to right before your activity, just to add something a little different here, I did add like half a cup of rice or oats, or like even a quarter cup of it. Basically just an example is you don't need to necessarily just go after like a snack food. You could just have a very, very small portion of that meal just to top off things and keep energy levels on the higher side. Over the last like year and a half, I've been a huge fan of just like, it sounds really boring, but it's just, I take rice in the morning if I have like a long bike ride or something, and I just take like a cup or half a cup, and I just microwave it, and it becomes nice and warm. It's kind of comforting in the morning, goes down really easy, has a bit of water component, and keeps my energy levels nice and high for activity wise. And then yeah, I added like sports drinks in here, which we're gonna talk about in a moment as well, but those kind of fall in that similar category too. All right, what to drink, and I guess also when to drink. Always just drink when thirsty. Water is preferred. Eating healthier, eating those more starchy foods, fruits and vegetables, you have more water coming in your diet. And I think sometimes people miss this. If people are watching me on my day-to-day, they'll see that I don't, unless when I'm doing like a video or talking to a lot of clients, I don't drink a whole lot of water, but a lot of water is just coming in through my diet. So I'm usually well hydrated. There's no set amount. People get sometimes, it's nice to simplify things, and for me to just tell you, oh yeah, just get 5 cups, 6 cups, 4 cups. If it's hot, get 6 cups. If it's even hotter, get 8, right? But there's no set amount because it's gonna vary in your diet. It's gonna vary on seasonal wise, activity wise. So yeah, it varies quite a bit. Even if you have someone that's like the same height, weight, age, activity wise and whatnot, their body composition is gonna be dramatically different. Their diet's like gonna be quite different as well. So no set amount, just drink when thirsty. Before activity, you could consider quarter cup, half a cup of water. I've seen a lot of people that do like half marathons. They'll do kind of like a half cup water because it's enough for you. It's usually enough for you to feel hydrated throughout the race without feeling like I need to 1 pee or that I'm gonna have a cramp. We'll talk about electrolyte and sports drinks in a moment, or you could do juice as well. And then the only caveat with the juice side of things, even the sports drink side of things, just careful spiking that blood sugar right before the activity, especially if you know this activity is going to go more than an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, right? Because the last thing you want is for you to get towards the end of that soccer game and now your blood sugar is trying to crash. It's a bad situation to be in or set yourself for. During the activity, small sips of preferred beverage as needed. Consider drinking more right before or during when the weather is hot. But again, you really don't need to go out of your way too much. And I'll get into this in a moment. A lot of getting into this in a moment. But you know, I build a story when I do a presentation. All right, and yeah, here we are. Electrolytes and sports drinks. We made it. So you're gonna see a lot of electrolytes that just have the 0 sugar, right? I remember doing, I think it was last year, I did a bike ride with a guy, and basically we were only out there for I think like maybe like 70K. It wasn't super long, but it wasn't super short either. So we were only out there for a bit, but it was a much higher intensity activity, at least for me. But anyways, he hopped in a gas station to get himself something, and he walked out and he had like I think it was a Powerade technically, but it was like one of those like zero drinks, like a Gatorade Zero, right? And I was like, oh, you do realize you just got the zero version. And he looked at it, he swore. He's like, because he wanted the sugar, right? He knows that sugar is what he needs for that higher intensity activity. Other than that, he just got flavored water, basically. I'll get to the electrolyte side of things in a moment, but that sugar, again, it is and it can be very beneficial depending on your activity. There are slightly better ways of getting it, like a more controlled way. There's a lot of these they're targeted after like cyclists and endurance athletes, but there are a lot of these powders you can buy that even like Gatorade and whatnot, you can buy like their G powder, but some of those will be like 0 sugar as well. But you can buy these powders and that will kind of let you control how much of that sugar component you're adding to it, right? So this way you don't add a lot, you don't get that massive blood sugar spike, you can just add smaller amounts of it, you get a bit of flavored water, and that can be quite nice during your activity. And just a warning, some of those endurance products, the energy gels, the powders, all that, they can be quite expensive. So if you are frugal about things or you want to save money, the cheapest way would be to buy little baby silicone squeeze bottles. Take your own sugar source, in this case maltodextrin, take a bit of sodium citrate. That's just a form of sodium. This is easier on the stomach. Basically, you're looking at these ingredients and you're like, oh, I can make that myself. And you totally can. And you can make a lot of it at once, right? Especially if you know you're gonna be very active through like a summer, for example, or a big cycling trip or a bikepacking trip. So yeah, on electrolytes and sport drinks, Electrolytes, they're amazing, excellent for diarrhea if you're doing a long day, all day, multi-day activities in the heat. But for the average healthy person, whether it's a soccer practice, a couple hour activity, you're just making expensive pee, in my opinion. You don't necessarily really need those. There's probably a few select cases where maybe you're not getting like enough potassium through the diet. So if you get more of certain minerals, that you get a little bit less cramping. Some people report that, but it might be a placebo in your head thing as well. Hard to say for sure. And then there's a lot of studies out there more kind of coming out talking about this. The nice thing about literature on the exercise side of things is there's a lot. Like you can find literature for your specific sport, for your specific age, your sex, and so on. So it's really neat that way. I like reading those studies. Anyways, this is just one example because sometimes people ask me about coconut water versus a carbohydrate electrolyte sport drink and water, and this was just an exercise trained men, and there was just essentially sort of no difference regarding exercise performance. So good to know. And in fact, the coconut water group actually had a little bit more bloating and stomach upsetness. Might have been a lot of coconut water. There's just also this article you can check out, Truth About Sports Drinks. Just search it on search it on Google Scholar, PubMed. And it's just talking about some of the industry side of things. Specifically, there's been some concerns like hyponatremia, which you basically get when you could say sweat too much, lose too much sodium, and you don't replenish that sodium, effectively dilute your body's electrolyte kind of balance side of things. It's interesting that because there were some claims initially that sports drink companies like Pepsi, Coca-Cola, they're making on the electrolyte side of things that, hey, you take this, you decrease, risk of hyponatremia and so on. It's better than water. I think I remember some like Gatorade type marketing. I don't know. Yeah, it's better than water, right? It turns out that getting too much of any fluid can increase your risk for hyponatremia, not necessarily just water. So, and there's concerns regarding sodium leading to fluid retention, and a lot of talk about the industry influence on this. So careful on that side of things, especially these days. I've seen a lot of like niche sports companies, sports supplement companies come out, and they'll have like electrolytes. They're like 3,000 milligrams of sodium, which is a lot of sodium. Your upper limit for your day for sodium is just a teaspoon, right? So just careful on that. All right, a few little shopping tips, tricks out of things. Avoid glucose fructose just because it has a much higher ratio of fructose than glucose, and the potential mechanism behind that is that the fructose gets converted to fat in the liver, which may not be ideal. So, and then also usually when it has glucose fructose, you're getting more sugar and versus more fruit in, which likely increases that blood sugar spike situation occurring. I would say generally avoid artificial sweeteners. They can lead to a bit of GI upsetness as well. And you might be better off getting that sugar for your activity versus the artificial sweetener. And then, the caffeinated side, that's a huge topic, of course, with the caffeinated drinks and sodas. Caffeine itself does have a performance load boosting effect. It's basically mimicking that stress response, getting that cortisol up. But you do want to be careful with that. And the reason you want to be careful with that is if you're a middle-aged adult, that you might be setting yourself up in a point where you're overexerting. And especially if you already have some arthrosclerosis going on, you could just set yourself up for a heart attack, right? That would be kind of the worst case. But in a typical case, that caffeine is going to lead to worse sleep quality. And worse sleep quality is the last thing you want when you're trying to optimize athletic performance and recovery, right? That recovery piece is so important because if you recover faster, you can train harder, you can train more, and you can make progress faster. All right, a little bit more shopping tips and tricks. Visit the produce section first. Try to fill your cart up with some produce. It starts to reflect your diet at the end of the day. It starts to limit some of the other options that you might buy because you look at your cart, it's like, I already got a lot of food, right? If you are buying processed snacks and processed foods, minimally processed, less ingredients are usually best, like rice cakes, dried fruit, and nut seed bars. Sugary is better than fatty. Salty, so granola bars and cookies are preferred versus chips, if you could say, for the same calories. I do have a small note on dairy because I'm talking to parents who are going to have kids. That it is very highly associated with asthma. There's some mechanisms that play there, sinus congestion and constipation. The constipation is more from like the galactose and the calcium. And what I would say is just try a dairy-free period for a few weeks and see if it makes a difference. I wish I had tried that growing up because dairy was a bit of a nightmare for me. I always had a running nose, which is why I kind of want to add this in here. This is for younger me out there, hopefully gets the word out and saves some misery. For breads, aim for whole grains. Basically try to get a little bit more fiber in. They do take some getting used to, so pair with some sweeter ingredients, right? If you need to add more jam on that to make that bread a little bit more tolerable, go for it, because eventually you get used to eating the bread. And the same way with the oatmeal. If you end up adding some maple syrup to your oatmeal, it's not the end of the world, because if you look at the calories, maybe you went from 450 calories by adding a couple tablespoons like brown sugar. From 450, maybe you went all the way to 550. That is still gonna be much, much lower versus like the bacon side of things. And then this is more for parents. You wanna start being sneaky about it because of that pleasure trap, picky eater situation. It can be a very difficult battle. So I would say invest in a strong blender. If you know your little one will have a smoothie, invest in a strong blender. Blend some greens on high first, maybe with some dates. And if you do that just with water, it will blend to basically a point where you can't tell once you add like the frozen fruit, the mango and berries in. The story I like to share is when I was doing like a cooking camp with kids, that if the kids saw us, or with the kids, we added spinach into the blender, and then, is my camera gonna die? Oh yeah, it's running low. That's okay. But yeah, if the kids saw us adding spinach in, they wouldn't want to taste it, or they taste it like it's not that great. But if we added the spinach in ourselves, and Barbara, the lady I was working with, she would add a lot of spinach in. When we added it ourselves, then gave it to the kids, they absolutely love the smoothies, right? Because you can't tell it's there. This was a different place I worked with kids. For cereals, we took the sugary cereal and we mixed in the cardboard cereal, the healthier cereal. The example I gave is rice puffs. Rice puffs are quite nice because they have a nice little crispy texture, kind of like a Rice Krispies type texture to it without the sweetness. It's just puffed up rice. So that's an example there, but you can also get like different cornflakes and whatnot. I will give a warning that if you're used to sugary cereal and you go that direction, they very much taste like cardboard. And then some of this is already talking about flavor conditioning, but basically if they enjoy a certain meal or food, start by adding a very small amount of what you kind of want them to eat more of. So for example, would be like adding chopped broccoli to their favorite pasta, right? Just chop it incredibly small that they can't even tell it's mixed in there. You can add this to like soups, chili, pasta, noodles, and more. And just get them to start developing a taste and a preference for it, and you can start to increase it. Okay, next up, let them use non-oily condiments, ketchup, barbecue sauce, Thai chili, chutneys. Yeah, they got some sodium to it, they got some like a sugar component to it, but you can't win every battle. And like I said, you're trying to move away from the really high fatty, salty, sugary foods, and this so you can kind of de-piece things a little bit. The other tip I have here is, again, air fry, bake without that oil. Without even getting into the physiology about it, we know this intuitively that, hey, if I'm going to go work out, I'm going to go for a run, I'm going to go to soccer practice, whatever, I know that if I eat a bunch of fried foods, I'm going to feel lethargic, tired, lazy, versus even like having Coca-Cola, you get a little bit of caffeine, but versus even having like a bowl of rice or oats, or even like having some bread, right? You feel incredibly different. You don't necessarily need to get into the calorie side of things. You don't even necessarily need to get into like, let's talk about blood flow physiology or optimizing blood flow. You can tell how you feel just by eating a certain food. But we intuitively already know that, hey, this is going to be, without the oil, that's going to be a little lighter. It's going to sit better, right? It's going to fuel us better. And then, you can use nuts and seeds to help transition, as I mentioned. Best would be like a raw almond butter, a dehydrated peanut butter. Those are just two examples. And then a food processor, kind of like the blender example, but this is more for savory stuff. So a very simple one is like taking a can of black beans, a couple cups of black beans, adding half a cup of salsa in there, and you can make a creamy black bean sort of dip. You can do the same thing with like chickpeas for like a hummus type thing. And you can use that for like sandwiches, for wraps, salads, bowls, and it's a way of not only adding flavor in there, but adding like those beans in there and making it more filling. And then for parents, model behaviors. It works better for younger kids. As you know, the older kids get, the more rebellious they get, the more they want to do exactly the opposite of what their parents want. So but for younger kids, you can model behaviors, make it fun, right? Make eating the healthy food fun, which is why it's a good thing I'm talking to the parents today. All right, there are specific foods to boost athletic performance and recovery. I don't think I'll end up even getting on this slide when I talk to the parents today, because I'll skip around the presentation, but also beets are a very hard sell to feeding kids, right? But for you, they're absolutely amazing. They work incredibly well. I've felt the benefits myself. Test it out. Take some beet juice. You can buy some store-bought beet juice. You can buy beet crystals. I'll show you in a moment. But there's a few different mechanisms at play here. Basically, they're rich in nitrates, which turns into nitric oxide, which vasodilates, right? That vasodilation increases that blood flow. It ultimately leads to less fatigue and improve performance. The nitric oxide also improves that calcium regulation for contracting the muscles. And you also get antioxidant effects, which we're going to get into, but it helps to deal with the oxidative stress. So if during exercise we're building oxidative stress, then antioxidant, as the name implies, literally deals with that oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is basically you get like these little free radicals of sorts. There's a free electron, and the antioxidants are able to donate an electron without actually becoming free radicals themselves. So that's kind of how the mechanism works there. But yeah, there's a lot of studies talking about the beet juice. They have people run up a hill, they have divers hold their breath longer. It's pretty remarkable stuff. And then yeah, different forms you can get your beet. Juice is obviously sort of the most convenient. It can be expensive if you're buying from the store. Beet crystals work quite well as well. You just take them and you mix them in water. I used to carry little beet crystal shots. Just a tablespoon of beet crystals, mix in water, and just take a shot during your activity or before your activity. You can buy cooked beets if you don't cook them yourself, you don't want to peel them yourself. And of course, you can just get them as sort of nature intended. And then there's this list of foods here: spinach, blackcurrant juice, tart cherry juice, purple grape juice, blueberries, watercress. Basically, antioxidant-rich foods have been shown research-wise to help reduce soreness, to help reduce that oxidative stress piece. But what this translates to is not just improved recovery, it's also even during the activity feeling less fatigue, which is very important. I'm going to use the soccer example here, but let's just say you're in a game. It means you're going to feel more energetic towards the end of the game than you otherwise would have had, and that's huge. That's pretty massive. And if anything, I should have made a stronger argument earlier for the fruit side of things, especially like the berries. And these are just, all these examples were just the ones I found through like nutritionfacts.org. I just had some notes from that, their video series on it. But there's tons. It doesn't necessarily need to be specifically these foods because it is likely those antioxidants that's having the benefit. All right, now we gotta switch gears and talk about energy management. There's only so much energy we have every day, week, month, year. So this is a concept that kind of came in my head when I was interviewing Dr. Rogers a few weeks ago. But basically, instead of thinking about managing your time, start thinking about it as managing your energy. We all have downtime, as in, when I look at like a client's day, for example, hey, there's a couple hours here where they could meal prep for the next 3 days. There's a couple hours here where they can go for a run, they can go work out. But it's not like they don't have the time, they don't have the energy. Generally speaking, eating healthier, living a healthier lifestyle helps you stay more energized, especially as you get older. So that's very important because if you're more energized, you have more energy on board, you're able to do more with the time you have. That's a beautiful way of putting it. I hope people make it as part of the video. And then many people believe if they exercise more, they need to eat more calories to replace those lost, or they're entering a calorie deficit. But this is not true. The body adjusts for this over weeks and months to reallocate energy. Think of it as an energy budget, and that's the way that Dr. Lau had kind of framed it in a recent, I don't know if it was recent, but in a talk that I heard him give anyways. So yeah, you want to think of it as an energy budget. And how do we know this? Well, by measuring how many calories people burn. I'm just started reading this book recently, but I've heard him talk about this before. He's got a couple articles out there as well, but the book is Burn by Herman Ponzer. We used to think that DEE right here is your daily energy expenditure, how many calories you're basically burning. We used to think of it as like it's additive, as in if you do physical activity, adds onto it, right? And even before coming across this, I knew that wasn't fully true, because if you have someone running 100 miles or you do like these crazy endurance races, and you look at their garment, I'll say they burn 50,000 calories or they burn 45,000 calories. Obviously, they don't burn that many calories. If they burn that many calories, they'd be dead because you just waste away, right? You're no way able to consume that many, even if you try your absolute hardest. So there's something happening here, but now we think of it as like a constrained energy model. So that by constrained, as in your body basically changes metabolism in other parts of it to account for that physical activity. And it's actually optimal for your body to be doing some physical activity so it can properly allocate energy to other parts and not over allocate energy elsewhere. It's complicated, but that's the short way of kind of putting it. And there's a few studies like that show this as well, not just like this one. Herman Ponzer example of this has the population where they measure how many calories they burn, and these are like one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations. So basically they go out and they literally walk thousands and thousands of steps every single day, but compared to your sedentary American, they don't actually burn any more energy, which is a crazy concept to kind of wrap your brain around. But it's very hard to sort of refute this because you have so much like evidence and studies for this. And like I said, with my endurance example, it's only 100 miles, you can sort of see for yourself, right? You can see for yourself that people that take a very exercise heavy approach for weight loss, yes, it can help, but it's going to help through influencing your, you could say, the appetite and what you kind of eat versus the actual calories you're burning. So the takeaway here is you don't need to be trying to eat more because of higher activity. More often, this actually leads to troublesome weight gain. The body will just regulate appetite as needed and just eat whole foods when you're hungry. Of course, we're surrounded by rich foods, so it's very, very easy. We're not like our ancestors that had to very much struggle and fight for the calories they're getting. We have the opposite problem. And to you, this is the same video, but it's actually, as you can see, it's a different day. It's very rainy outside. And I'm going to record the rest of what I have. So basically that day I gave 3 back-to-back talks on what you heard already, and I did a little Q&A afterwards, and a lot of the parents had questions about, of course, their own health, but also regarding some of the specifics that I had gone over. And now we're just going to transition this conversation. As you can see by the slide here, I'm going to talk about a little bit about weight loss. And while I was making this video, I had a bunch of tabs open covering different subtopics. So this is just me going through those studies. And of course, whenever I open up one study, I go to its references, which opens up more studies. So this is me just covering a whole bunch of different topics. I'm going to talk about carb loading. We're going to talk about weight loss, as you can see here. I'm going to talk about some of the sex differences that we potentially see out there, and some specifics regarding like performance during activity and even afterwards. So yeah, let's get right into it. Let's just keep going. So initially, this idea of like a constrained energy model, having an energy budget, it may sound like a bad news that your body is just going to burn X calories with or without exercise. But this is actually good news in a way, because it means you don't need to spend endless hours on a treadmill trying to create a calorie deficit. You can do it through a much easier approach through your diet, right? And the calorie deficit is created because your body needs to burn X calories. That's why you can create that deficit in the first place. Again, it's a bit of a confusing topic to kind of wrap your head around, especially the first time hearing about this. And I'll have a future video covering in more detail. And really, and honestly, all these subtopics that I'm going to go into, these can all be videos themselves and lectures themselves. So we're just gonna go over the gist of it, the big picture, just to cover and give you an idea. And just want to be clear, exercise is still incredibly beneficial despite not having that additive calorie benefit to it. For immune function, mental health, improving energy levels, hormone health, blood sugar management, of course the social benefits like participating in sports. And even though it doesn't technically influence, you could say, that calories outside of the equation, it can help facilitate, and often does help facilitate, better dietary choices and regulating hunger. And many other things. Like one example that I typically give is that a big reason why people gravitate towards the more calorie-rich foods is that we get these endorphins, right? We get that like pleasure, and exercise is just kind of an outlet to get those endorphins and get the pleasure side of things without having to rely on these higher calorie-rich foods. And again, this calories in, calories out is always the big picture. So an energy budget does exist, but remember, we're getting these calories from different sources. We're getting them from the carbs, the fats, the protein, and getting these from a variety of different food stuff. And there's going to be a lot of factors determining how nutrients are metabolized. One major one is, which we're going to talk a little bit about, is actually going to be sex. And there's a ton of research on this topic, but I'm just going to try to summarize some of the older research, some of the new research, and some of the key findings. So for endurance sports, I may have mentioned this earlier, but females are known to oxidize lipids more, so burning fat more so than carbohydrates, as in stored glycogen, compared to males. And this, especially at higher intensities, has to do with lower respiration rate, being able to bring in less oxygen compared to men. But I want to be a little more specific here. It is more complex than just simply saying that. There's 4 main determinants at play: exercise intensity, training history, nutritional state, and of course the exercise duration. And as I mentioned earlier, lower intensity endurance exercise training, fasted state training, and longer duration are associated with greater lipid oxidation, basically burning more fat, just because oxygen is coming in at a lower rate. You don't need that quick, more efficient glucose at that time, so the body has a slight preference for burning the lipid. Okay, and then here's where we start to get into some of the sex differences. The menstrual cycle plays a pretty significant role. So the follicular, never how to say it, phase, in the mid phase of it, there is reported to be greater exercise performance, better glucose production, but in the earlier phase, performance may actually be impaired. In the luteal phase, it's reported to have increased protein catabolism, so you're burning more protein, and you're using less proglycogen, which is a form of glycogen that's like quickly burned, you could say. So it's like kind of ready to use. And then premenopausal in general, you oxidize less leucine, so also burning less protein at that stage. And I'm going to make more sense of this in a moment because I know it's a little all over the place. So what about the earlier advice that I had to carb load, eating more carbohydrate-rich foods leading up to activity? Does that still apply for females, for women? So I have one study here. It's an older study as an example. And I do note they're testing in the mid-follicular phase. So right here, we can see that men increased, you don't have to read all of it, but men basically increased glycogen concentration by about 41% in response to dietary manipulation, which was increasing carbohydrate intake. And then compared to women, did not increase the glycogen concentration or the performance time. And they reported that women oxidized more lipid and less carbohydrate and protein compared to men during exercise. Okay, we're already starting to see a potential difference in females being able to, you could say, use glycogen during the activity. And it translating to potential performance differences, right? So then I have another study here, and it's just endurance exercise, and that's just intramuscular carbohydrate loading. So basically, even though some of these earlier studies kind of lean towards that, the findings are ultimately quite mixed. You see studies that showing greater, lesser, or equal utilization of carbs during mid to high intensity endurance exercise. So we want to look at why there might be differences and why sometimes you see an effect and sometimes you don't see an effect. So one of the reasons you're going to see differences is just because of studies using different methods, including the exercises, the endurance intensity, the duration, some of those factors I mentioned earlier. Some of these studies are looking at different muscle groups, different participant training statuses, the nutritional status, of course, the menstrual cycle, and even if they're using any sort of birth control or hormonal contraception. So yeah, it becomes a little bit more complicated, but there will be some takeaways, and they're coming right about now. So one of the limitations of some of these earlier studies looking at men versus women was the fact that these studies may not have been carb loading appropriately or getting to a higher amount of carbohydrate intake per kilogram of body mass. So for example, here's a study that shows that, okay, you just need higher amounts, at least 9 grams per kilogram of body mass. And here I have translated the absolute intake of 540 grams into the amount it would be for potatoes or dried oats. It's quite a bit of carbohydrate is what I'm trying to say. I know these two up here are very blurry, but basically it's just because I took screenshots when I was making notes in the study. Basically, it just suggests that it's not sex dependent provided there's enough carbohydrate intake, right? But now here's where things get a little interesting and where you see that little sex difference is during the mid-follicular phase. There might be a reduced capacity to store muscle glycogen, and that's actually where you get the biggest increase in the performance side of things, as we saw earlier. But that's actually why you need to get that higher intake. So basically, at a lower intake, especially in that mid-follicular phase, it might make more of a difference for women in terms of using glycogen, which is then going to affect, of course, the exercise performance. So some specifics here, even though the earlier studies show 9 grams per kilogram, some of the other studies show that you need at least 8 grams per kilogram. So somebody who's 70 kilogram body weight would need about 560 grams, which is about 2,240 calories. So that's a lot of calories, right? And this study over here, again, the paper is right down here. You can take a look at it if you like to. This study here shows that for women, they might not always need to get some sort of excess calories in order to get that carb loading benefits of that increased glycogen storage. And there's also something called supercompensation for both men and women, which is basically consuming 10, 12, sometimes more grams per kilograms of carbohydrate with no exercise up to the trial. So think like 3 days before race day, that you can get this extra compensation in your muscles to store more carbohydrate, more glycogen. And this is why I believe like those carbohydrate foods, those starchy foods are so beneficial for the athletic side of things, because when your body gets that glucose in, it doesn't want to just burn it off. It wants to put it in the muscles so it can use it, right? And your muscles are going to make adaptations so they can try their best to store more glycogen. You store more glycogen, you're able to get out there, you have more energy on board, especially for endurance activities. And when you start running out of glycogen is when you usually start to feel that fatigue and even increased injury risk. There's some neat studies coming out for that. So you're going to see some similar guidelines for men, about 8 to 10 grams per kilograms. And I did put a range here this time, show you the lower and higher end. And it's important to understand for this 70 kilogram example, whether it's male or female, based on their body composition, how much lean mass they have, how muscular they are, it is going to change on how much carbohydrate intake they should get. But those are just what guidelines say. And there's some general guidelines here based on activity, but I just want you to remember that generally speaking, you do get better performance recovery when carb loaded, but at the same time, you don't necessarily need to go super overboard if you're doing very light training, right? You're not going to run out of those glycogen stores in that light training, so therefore you don't need to be super concerned of it. Of course, a lot of the carbohydrate-rich foods are on the healthier side anyways, so it's a good place to be. And then yeah, 8 grams per kilograms. It depends based on total caloric intake, but it can translate to about 80, 85%, even 90%. So that's definitely the starchy foods I was talking about earlier, and fruits and vegetables. Okay, so why bother with carb loading? Well, better recovery. You might be able to extend duration up to 20%, if not more. And of course, you do your activity with greater intensity, right? Just because you have more fuel to burn. So, and then generally, it is more important for events longer than 90 minutes, as we saw in the previous slide. And then before the event, you could do a 3-day exercise taper, which can do that super compensation, doubling those glycogen stores. And the way you would do it, if you want some specifics, is you need at least 70% carbohydrate intake, if not more, trying to get to that 8 to 10 grams per kilogram. And then tapering exercise can be as simple as, okay, today I just do like a 20-minute low intensity, I do that again, and then no exercise the day before the event. And that's shown to really optimize the glycogen stores you have coming into the event, and hence letting you perform better. And then yeah, as I mentioned, females in the mid follicular phase, they might need more carbohydrates, and it might be even more important to get those carbohydrates in. And generally speaking, athletes should try their best to take advantage of the super compensation, the glycogen loading, the carb loading before key competitions. But it's not only useful just leading up to the events. Training harder, recovering better leads to further athletic improvement, allowing you to better reach your athletic potential. And then for during activity, here's some specifics here. It may not always be super easy to follow or make sense for your training and goals, but I encourage you to pause the video. You can glance over these, take a look, and then of course there's other factors at play, and if you're interested in learning more, I do have that study that source cited below there. Interesting enough, during activities, females of course show improvement, but the phase does play a role. You can see one study here gave glucose solutions at different phases of the menstrual cycle, and both the follicular phase and the luteal phase, there was an improvement. And it's interesting enough that they actually might derive more energy from the drinks compared to their own glycogen stores that they have compared to males. And then as for the type, I'm not going to get into too many specifics about this in this video, but glucose and fructose is needed. Glucose is that short-term fuel, fructose is a bit of that longer-term fuel, which is why if you buy those energy gels, they do have a fructose component to them. That way you're mitigating some of that potential glucose spike, and then potential fall, right? If you have that fructose, which is a little bit of a longer curve, that can mitigate some of that energy crash, potential crash. As I said earlier, once your body's out of that glycogen, it's forced to burn fat and protein. So if you get a carbohydrate intake in, it's going to spare your body from burning protein. And this is one study. This study is actually in females that basically demonstrate improvements. And there's a strong trend towards a reduction in protein oxidation in the post. And if you were to look at the details for the post, you'll see that they were given a defined formula diet immediately after the workout. Basically, they were given some carbohydrates. You can see here how much they were given. And then for the other trial, the same supplement was consumed with breakfast, and a placebo was taken post-exercise. And it was when it was consumed post-exercise where it demonstrated improvements and that strong reduction in burning protein. Okay, now there is the use case scenario where maybe you're at a tournament, maybe you're just doing a lot of volume in one day, multiple days, right? Maybe you're trekking, hiking, something like that. It is actually, according to the study, is well established that if you get 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour in the short term, 0 to 4 hours, you do get, that is like the way to go about it in terms of quickly replenishing glycogen stores, so you can engage in another activity or more of the same activity, whatever it may be. And this study always notes that there's not any convincing evidence to support sex-specific differences here for this recovering glycogen stores. So good to know. So when I talked about protein earlier, minimum requirements are low, but getting more does have this anabolic effect. It's not just about getting more protein, but the timing of it is very important, right? I know these two screenshots from this study are very blurry, but you basically want to spread the intake out over the day versus end loading dinner. And the reason that end loading dinner is here, because a lot of people end up just, you can say, getting most of the protein intake in for the dinner. Maybe their breakfast is like, I don't know, toast, cereal, something like that, and their lunch can be on the smaller side, so they're sort of end loading. But if you're really trying to optimize that anabolic effect, and the timing of it's very important, and we're talking about 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal, and you'll see there's some factors that it depends on when it comes to this sort of range, and if you should even go more or less. But yeah, you do want to consider spreading the intake out, just because you can hit that gas pedal a little more efficiently. Just assume that once you eat these 20 to 40 grams, you have this short-term sort of boost in that anabolic activity and protein synthesis activity. So it can be very important if you're trying to maximize that effect to spread that intake out. When it comes to optimizing nutrition for sports, for activity, there's a lot of factors at play here. So a personalized approach, whether you do it yourself or trial and error, whether you work with someone, is likely the way to go, especially if you are a professional athlete and this is your livelihood. So occasionally I do get older clients ask me about, okay, what about protein intake for preserving muscle mass? So this was a study that had a high protein, 3 grams kilogram per body fat-free mass, and then up is the usual protein, which is 1.5 grams per kilograms of fat-free mass. And interestingly enough, the high HP here did not enhance protein synthesis or muscle mitochondrial function in either the young or the older participants, right? Which I hope at this point isn't super surprising because as we saw earlier, minimum requirements are so low, so that 1.5 grams per kilogram fat-free mass, that's already going to be well above the minimum. So not super surprising that they didn't find this enhanced benefit. And then here's another study. This was just for specifically looking at older men, but they basically they did a one-legged knee immobilization. Basically, they have a full leg cast on and they just measure, okay, let's just see, because when you're not using the muscle, your body just gets rid of it, right? It's a very much a use it or lose it situation. And then for these men, they gave, for some of these men, they gave them a 20 grams twice a day. So they're spreading the 20 grams out twice a day. And then even that 20 gram drink twice a day, it has some carbohydrate, had a little bit of fat into it as well. But it not slow down the rate of muscle loss during this short-term experiment. So again, the protein intake did not slow down that muscle loss. And that's 40 grams of extra. Okay, what about intake for healthier older women? Well, this is a different study, but it was open, so I'm including it in this video for, I guess, interesting. But basically, this study was just looking at 24-hour energy expenditure. And they didn't find any significant difference in energy expenditure, which should be super surprising because we went over the energy budget idea. But the type of macronutrients you burn, it does change, right? So in this study, they were looking at strength training and they did see a significant increase in fat oxidation, which shouldn't be super surprising because if you think about strength training, you are engaging in that usually in that more moderate level in terms of like your heart rate and the effort you're putting in. So you're more likely to be burning lipid at that point versus the higher intensity sort of like you can think sprints, right? Where you're burning more glycogen side. When you need that quick fuel. And they saw a decrease in carbohydrate oxidation. So when it comes to, yes, the energy budget exists, but again, there might be a very small benefit in this fat oxidation. The type of macronutrients you burn does change, right? There is, maybe there always will be, a lot of talk about this training low idea or this fasted training idea. So this is for male participants, but there is a growing literature that doing some fasted training has some benefits. You can see some of the benefits listed here. Basically, the way you want to think about it is, hey, when I'm training fasted, my body's running out of that glycogen storage, and now it's having to make compensations in order to effectively provide enough energy, right? And then those energy efficiency improvements, you're going to see those even more profound when you have that energy available. So one way to think about it, it's not on the slide there, but it's like, trying to make an analogy here. You're going to the airport, let's just say there's like a lot of cars on the road, or let's just say everyone's going to the airport, right? But there's only so many roads, there's only so many taxis available, and then you try to make efficiency improvements in the city, so you try to make more roads, try to make sky trains, get more cab drivers. Well, then when you then maybe this travel craze dies down. But when this travel craze pops up during the holidays, whatever it is, you have all these efficiency improvements there, and now you're able to better utilize them. And then on the female side of things, this is why I pointed out the previous study was for males, is that it's not clear if it's beneficial, neutral, or maladaptive, and that's likely because there's differences based on the hormonal side of things, right? The menstrual cycle, the different phases, and also contraceptive use. So even though it's not clear, interesting enough, there are a lot of female athletes reporting to be training low, but the potential benefits may not translate the same way. So that's an area where we need more research on. Okay, so I talked a lot about endurance sports, a little bit on the strength training side, but you might be wondering, what about my specific sport or activity? So there's a lot of factors at play. The biggest two, what I would say that probably matters to like the everyday person, is the frequency of training and the intensity of it. Because if your training load is heavy, you're doing a lot of training, then these principles are going to matter that much more, just because every gain in recovery and performance is going to compound, right? You're already investing a lot of time, actually I should say energy, you're investing a lot of energy into training, so it's important to get a better return on your investment. If you're working out, training a few times per week, low intensity, this starts to matter less because you'll have more than enough time to recover either way. Of course, there's a lot of benefits to eating healthier to secure longevity, which is why I got this ghost here. I also have the ghost here because it's October, so Halloween's coming up. So yeah, basically it's important to just be eating healthier for one, feeling more energetic throughout the day, but so you can also continue to do whatever activity you enjoy. Thank you. I hope this video isn't 10 hours long. I don't think it will be. I think I went through the slides fast enough at the end there. Comment below if you want me to cover a specific top topic in more detail. Eventually I'll go into some of those subtopics that I just kind of glossed over, but I hope that gives you an idea on what to eat before, during activity, after activity, and how you can optimize the performance and recovery side of things of whichever activity and exercise you enjoy. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something new. I'm going to be diving into the sports nutrition side of things a lot more as this channel progresses. This is just because I was given this opportunity to talk to some parents about it that I figured might as well talk to you as well. Thanks YouTube. Catch you next time.